The amount of disagreements people have with me over this basic truth is surprising. Oh, most certainly not. They are too sensible, too intelligent, and too composed under pressure to deal with anything as illogical as superstitions. Some people will even argue with me about it for a very long period, like I wouldn't be aware. Me, I am an EMT, and my family has 4 generations of emergency medical workers. Both of my parents have been paramedics for decades, and there are numerous additional relatives who work in hospitals or ambulances. They also believe that I wouldn't be aware. However, source is never an issue. They respectfully defer to my morbid expertise when it comes to things of the body and never question my knowledge of what I'm talking about when it comes to a real medical emergency. When we enter the hospital or see an ambulance arrive, there are no disagreements. It's simply superstitions that prevent them from believing me. The notion that these emergency workers are superstitious must make them uneasy. One day, they don't want to be critically ill and dependent on a ghost believer while sitting in the back of an ambulance. They don't want to question whether the single person who can save their lives is concerned about the full moon overhead or the possibility of a black cat crossing their path. So I dropped the matter. Just so you know, some paramedics do not take shifts during the full moon. I learned all about EMS folklore from my parents. How to avoid using the Q word while working. How they always had a busy night during the full moon. How you cannot expect to be able to read or sleep while on duty because doing so will undoubtedly result in a ton of calls. Before you can rest your eyes, you must sleep with your boots on and your stethoscope around your neck. At the end of your shift, you will be pleasantly delighted to see your relief team. You will undoubtedly need it severely on your next call if you run out of supplies and don't replenish it immediately. Additionally, you should never attempt to eat at a restaurant while working. Before you can complete your order, you will be called out. These minor superstitions, in my opinion, were never intended to frighten us. For that, they had plenty of other stories. We dubbed these tales the Little White Coffin. They operated similarly to the original Grimm fairy tales, which were a collection of gloomy and occasionally terrifying tales intended to protect us from danger. They outlined and clarified the most crucial guidelines we needed to adhere to. You shouldn't use the monkey bars to hang upside down. Avoid jumping in the park between rocks. You cannot leave the neighborhood on your bike by yourself. Remain far away from the school bus's back and wheels. Until you're older, don't eat hard candy. You can't wear Heelys at all. No bouncy balls from bubblegum machines, even if they're only a quarter. When we asked why, Mom would politely but firmly respond that she had dealt with a young patient who was roughly our age and had experimented with similar risks. And do you know what took place? Their mom had to buy a little white coffin to bury them in, Mom would inquire. Definitely morbid. However, when I went out to play, I stayed in the neighborhood and never attempted to swallow a bouncing ball. The little white coffin legends grew up with me, and I lived well past their dangers. They would caution us about the risks of exploring pitch-black cities after dark, the dangers that await lone travelers in the woods, not only from untamed creatures but also from the base of sheer cliffs encircled by slick roads. They fiercely cautioned us about the illicit narcotics they frequently encountered while working. When I was a junior in high school, I recall my mother storming in the door one evening following an especially trying phone call. In a panic, she asked me whether I had any friends who would have encouraged me to do new things and attend parties. She didn't calm down until I had completely reassured her of my relative unpopularity. Then, she revealed that she had spent the final hour of the night trying to revive one of my classmates who had apparently overdosed. Shaken, she continued, he thought it was just weed, but they're lacing it with something horrible nowadays. It took 5 rounds of compressions to get a pulse back. When I went back to school the next Monday, I couldn't help but wonder who had been her patient. I'll admit that during attendance, I paid a little more attention in case someone's name was missing. After I received my EMT certification, my parents' recollections became considerably more detailed. After I started on the truck, I was given access to a lot of new little white coffin stories, as if I were a peer to confide in and a daughter to guard. They seemed to be attempting to prepare me for the worst scenarios I would encounter at work. I was moved by their tales and even acquired some of my own. I didn't imagine they could say anything concerning EMS that would bother me after a few years. I must admit that my stomach fell a little when my mother revealed that there was one anecdote she had kept to herself because she was afraid it would be too disturbing. She clarified that she had forgotten to tell me because she was scared that if she did so when I was younger, I would be terrified to go near the hospital. However, on the day she made this revelation, I was much older. She also told me this anecdote. My mother was employed by a hospital in the northern New Jersey hilly woods when she was a young paramedic. The region around New York City, with its expansive urban streets and cushion of well-lit suburbs, is typically what people think of when they think of New Jersey. The state as a whole is actually quite densely populated. However, the state has some desolate, gloomy areas that make you question how inhabited they may really be. Far from the bright lights and secure bustle of the city, you wonder how much could be concealed in the forests out there. My mother used to work for a small hospital, and it remains so today. Like hermit crabs looking for abandoned shells to nest in, the hospital developed the practice of renting out old, unused medical complexes for its paramedics to use as their quarters while on duty. The hospital only has 2 actual hospital buildings with emergency rooms, located near the suburbs, but its paramedics were expected to serve the large rural areas to the north with just as much speed and quality of care as the area immediately surrounding the hospitals. The hospital was able to reach North Jersey by placing them distant from the main structures. This is how my mother ended up spending long, gloomy evenings in a deserted mining hospital, all of herself except for her fellow crew members and the sound of the trees around the tiny structure. The hospital decided to keep a tiny office space for the crew to post up in while leaving the rest of the building empty for financial reasons. The bright light of the additional lamps did nothing to alleviate the sense that they were upsetting a place that had been inactive for a while and probably shouldn't have remained that way, despite the fact that it was well equipped with cots, lazy boys, a microwave, a refrigerator, and easy access to a private bathroom. However, the old hospital space was required once more, this time to aid the community. Security guards were hired to patrol the area and make sure the crew could return to their lodgings without fear after locals reported entrepreneurial persons breaking into the virtually abandoned structure. Throughout the day, the security staff patrolled the premises, keeping an eye out for would-be squatters and inquisitive adventurers. In a heroic attempt to reassure the paramedics of their personal safety, they had originally been employed to patrol the entire facility at night as well. On their first night in the hospital, the paramedics vetoed this practice by an overwhelming majority. When the well-meaning security officers shone their bright headlights into the shocked, agitated faces of the on-duty medics, they woke them up and elicited a litany of imaginative curse words as they vented their frustration. Thus, they were left alone by the security personnel. Though they were cautious to avoid the medic quarters every night, Mom would spot them driving about the building and using their powerful flashlights to inspect the other rooms. Mom spent months stationed there and became accustomed to the reverberating quiet of the deserted hallways, as well as the old buildings creaking and settling. Through the windows of her quarters, it was calming to see the torch glow flowing between beds in the old patient ward across the building. It was pleasant to feel cared for during the long, dark night shifts, despite the slight nervousness that was gnawing at the back of her mind, probably a persistent concern that the guards might suddenly wake them up again. Despite its intrinsic reliance on collaboration, emergency care has a strangely alienating effect on the majority of responders. As my mother had experienced, there was a belief that you had to shoulder your responsibilities by yourself. Make sure your patient is alive, your scene is under control, and your ambulance is clean. The paramedics stationed in that old building had to put in a lot of energy because it was and still is a demanding profession. Each medic would sneak a quick slumber in between calls, and the darkest hours of the night would descend into a cozy, delicate silence. With their boots ready and their bulky uniform coats wrapped around them, they shielded themselves from the general nervousness that came with being on duty by curling up on various couches and bunks and sleeping. My mother initially noticed anything really odd on a night like this. Fear of missing a call and her partner's incessant snoring kept her awake as she lay in her bunk. She was still thinking about the filth she had seen at a hoarder's residence during their previous visit, which made her feel dirty. Moving their patient swiftly to the safety and warmth of the ambulance, they had hardly been in the house itself. The image of the maggot-infested dishes of decaying food that perched dangerously on top of meticulously arranged stacks of newspapers, Plastic lawn chairs and garment bags that were as tall as Mom herself was still too vivid for her to forget. She was not comforted by the breadcrumb tracks of mouse spaces that led from these platters to the floor. It was the type of detail Mom would frequently notice on the scene, which made her a great paramedic and made it hard to forget such a vivid call. She slipped out of her bunk, accepting that this was going to be a restless night. She decided to clean as much of herself as she could without actually taking a shower, but she would simply have to grit her teeth and get through the remainder of the shift. Perhaps the partial cleansing would put her to sleep, or perhaps she had read a little. She crept into the bathroom, a tiny one-seater with the added convenience of a shower stall, a luxury that appealed to Mom, and quietly shut the door after herself. She silently thanked God that the old building's plumbing was still in working order as she turned on the wash basin. Mom took the time to admire the plumes twirling in the cool, dry bathroom air as she watched the steam rise up from the wash basin. However, she didn't want to watch the mirror fog for too long. She adjusted the cold tap slightly to prevent herself from getting burned, rolled her sleeves up as high as they would go, and dived in. The combination of the inexpensive hand soap and hot water produced the exact result Mom had hoped for. Her whole body relaxed a little as soon as her hands touched the water. She scrubbed her forearms and hands as if she were getting ready for surgery, squishing the soap between her fingers, probing under each fingernail, brushing the bubbles over her elbows, and awkwardly pushing them under the faucet to rinse everything off. It instantly lifted her spirits for the remainder of the evening. She sought this newfound calm by washing her face, letting her hair get a little wet before pulling it back tightly against her head, taking off her boots and socks, and cleaning her calves and feet as best she could. She sat back and watched the devastation of her wash basin shower, finally satiated. The trash can, which was already bursting at the seams when she began this secret bath, was surrounded by discarded paper towels. Despite her best efforts to keep the room reasonably dry, the wash basin was completely soaked and a few little puddles of water reflected on the slippery tiles surrounding it. Mom turned off the wash basin, which stopped the water flow. Steam ascended from the tap, which was still blasting deliciously hot water, filling the room and condensing heavily on the mirror. Before it was gone, she was unaware of how loud the water's surge had been, reverberating throughout the little space. When she was done cleaning up, she put her boots back on, dried off, and opened the bathroom door to let the air dry. As Mom gathered her used paper towels and used them to wipe up the puddles she had left on the floor and sink before throwing them in the trash can, cold air surged into the bathroom. She applied pressure to the towel pile, causing it to compress sufficiently to tie off the black garbage bag inside. The air vacuum inside the bag was working against her as she pulled hard to try to get it out of the can. After a humiliating amount of yanking and wiggling, she managed to extract the bag from the can. She moved away from the trash pail and took a triumphant step back. She leaped out of her skin after taking another look at herself in the mirror. Directly behind her in the reflection was a figure whose identity was hidden by the condensation as it peered over her shoulder. Mom whirled around and cursed. Either her partner or one of the men from the other ambulance team that was stationed there with them, she imagined, had sneaked up on her. However, nobody was present when she turned around. She was perplexed at first, but soon grew impatient. She was obviously being teased by one of the Brain Trust members she collaborated with. Having been the target and the target of several EMS jokes, she was well acquainted with this type of jackassery. She had witnessed elaborate pranks, running gags, and morbidly humorous uses of intubation kits and cadaver brains, and right now she didn't feel like any of it. Mom swept out of the bathroom after grabbing the trash bag, scanning the main room to see who Moran had chosen to ambush her in the middle of the night. Mom left her in the bunk, where her boyfriend was still snoring. Mom could see both men on the other unit still tucked under their coats and blankets around the corner of the angled room. The room was silent save for the glow of the television, which displayed a blank blue screen and the soft sway of the oscillating space heater. Mom thought about the other paramedics' relative innocence and the terrible luck she would undoubtedly bring upon them if she woke them up for anything other than an upcoming emergency call. She sighed. She concluded that they deserved a wake-up call. They were feigning sleep to avoid her anger after one of them had startled her in the middle of the night at their eerie building. She was about to prod her awake by approaching her companion when she heard a sound. She was stopped in her tracks by the sound of running water. Confused, she stood there. Did she not shut off the water? She was positive she recalled shutting off the water. She returned to the lavatory after dropping the trash bag by the door of their quarters. Billowing steam sprang up again as the hot water shot into the wash basin at full blast. Mom thought about the tap for a second, forgetting the evil trick, and then she reached forward and shut it off. Already attempting to explain the event away, she twisted the valves tight. She went back to her bunk, now contentedly sleepy. She struggled to recall when and why she had switched the wash basin back on while she sat on the thin mattress. She heard it as she contemplated a slight want to wash her hands once more after handling the trash bag. There was a faint groan from the loo, too faint to wake the paramedics who were asleep. The sound of running water arose once more a second later. With eyes popping out of her head, Mom jumped off her bunk and crossed to the restroom. Before it became motionless, she cautiously peered into the room and saw the hot water handle twisting on by itself. For a minute she stood there, terrified and gazing at the flowing water. She searched frantically for a plausible explanation for what she had just witnessed. She didn't get anything. Stepping up to the basin, she washed her hands once more while attempting to ignore the figure that was once again hiding over her shoulder in the mirror's reflection. As she exited the restroom, she dried her hands, shut off the faucet, and switched out the light with the paper towel. Mom gazed at the open bathroom door while sitting on her bunk. Mom was still sitting there, staring at the empty bathroom, when her partner woke up hours later when the sun rose, marking the end of her shift. Lauren replied, "Good morning," as she rubbed her eyes and swung her legs off the bed. "Have you slept?" At first, Mom remained silent, her forehead still wrinkled in focus. "Corinne," Lauren asked. "Well," Mom continued to consider as she glanced at her companion. "Yes, I believe a little." With a moan, Lauren got up to stretch and gather her belongings. Mom's nerves were calmed by the other medic's movements as she continued to stare towards the lavatory. "Hi, Lauren," Mom caught her partner's eye. She tried to come up with a polite approach to inquire as to if she had ever seen a ghost in this room or if she had ever experienced a waking dream. At last, she gave up. "What's wrong with this plumbing system?" Instead, she inquired. Even though emergency responders frequently heard ghost stories, Mom was still hesitant to make her belief in them public. While the general public frequently praised the EMTs and other responders who volunteered their time to provide free or significantly more affordable emergency medical care to their communities, paid responders had some prejudice against them. They were also fairly prevalent among volunteer ambulance squads, which could be a challenging group to align with in New Jersey EMS. Some squads were highly respected, while others were viewed as utterly inept. The paramedics and paid EMTs frequently developed a slight superiority complex as a result of the volunteers' perceived uneven level of care. Even now, EMS workers will call certain providers paid volunteers, which is derogatory for a paid first responder whose qualifications are in doubt. Mom was not interested in being identified as a paid volunteer. She therefore chose not to share her observations with any of the other paramedics who shared the old hospital. She would only discuss spirits and hauntings with Lauren, her companion. Lauren wouldn't blame Mom for bringing up the subject, even though she didn't believe a ghost could actually move objects or tamper with actual objects, and expressed to her how absurd the idea was. In addition, she had been experiencing strange dreams while assigned to that building, which she felt were worth investigating because they might have psychological ramifications. Nevertheless, fantasies be damned. Lauren soon went asleep when their unit was given the opportunity. In contrast, Mom found it far more difficult to fall asleep after the bathroom incident. Most evenings, she listened to Lauren's soft snoring while she sat awake and watched the torch flicker through the ward. In an attempt to justify it, she even looked into misbehaving sinks to check if anyone else was experiencing problems with their tap turning on its own. She only came across examples similar to hers in conversations about paranormal activity. Her anxiousness was not reduced by this, but soon the lack of sleep overtook her. Despite working the night shift, she was too exhausted to be kept awake by ghost stories and broken plumbing because the outside world needed her attention during the day. She quickly regained the ability to fall asleep in between calls. Mom slept well one gloomy night, cocooned in her home-brought blankets. Mom fell into a deep sleep as soon as she put her head down after a long day of trudging through the midwinter cold on an endless procession of errands. The paramedics slept and time passed swiftly. A clear evening sky replaced an early sunset, and as the night grew longer, stars began to appear in the azure expanse of the heavens. Unbeknownst to them, a torch beam began to waver in the old ward window at the far end of the hospital. As the moon dragged across the sky, it moved slowly, room by room, through the building. After a while, the entrance to the medics' quarters was illuminated by the torch. It looked across the paramedics' dozing bodies who were unfazed. It roamed throughout the room, lighting up stray boots, books that were open and face down to maintain the reader's position, and additional goodies that had been grabbed from hospital break rooms. Too softly to disturb any of the paramedics, one of their radios chirped. As the torch beam hit the radio, the sleeping medics were still unable to correct the mistake of lowering the volume too much. "Hey, look vibrant." Mom was awakened by a persistent whisper. She tried to cling to her remaining slumber by keeping her eyes closed. The man she heard talking to was undoubtedly chatting to his own partner because, as she recalled, she was working with Lauren that evening. Once more, the voice spoke. "Awaken." It seemed to be only a few inches away from her ear. She was startled by fear, which swiftly turned to rage as she sat up, prepared to vent to the other medic. The other 3 people in the room were still sound sleeping, lying in their bunks. Mom took a moment to look around, attempting to figure out what had woken her awake, but nothing moved. The radio began to chirp a few seconds later. 52. Quietly, the dispatcher inquired. When Mom got out of bed and crossed to the walkie, her tummy flipped. 52 here, she answered. As she woke Lauren, gathered her belongings, and got into the ambulance, she replayed that scene in her head. She made an effort to persuade herself that she had been awakened by the dispatcher's call over the radio. However, the soft soprano that explained the urgency they were reacting to sounded nothing like the loud baritone voice that roused her. The medic unit was moved again shortly after that evening. This was nothing new, as the hospital was constantly buying and selling buildings throughout the area. Soon after, Mom and the other paramedics who had been assigned to the former mining hospital were moved to different units around the region, where they periodically ran into one another and idly chatted about the weird things they had seen in the ancient structure. They made the decision one day to get in touch with the security guards who had been watching their shaky hospital. After all, the guys had kept watch over them and had been gracious enough to do so despite being reprimanded for awakening the medics who were asleep. At a pub near the old hospital, the paramedics and the guards celebrated a shared evening off by laughing and chatting. In a quiet time, Lauren murmured, "Hey, by the way, thanks for letting us sleep. Seeing you guys wash the remainder of the building was comforting." The guards appeared confused. "What are you discussing?" one inquired. Lauren's forehead wrinkled. "I'm referring to your patrols. How come you didn't wake us up during your walkthroughs?" As he finished his drink, the younger of the 2 guards remarked casually, "Oh, we didn't do any more walkthroughs." The older guard clarified, "When we saw that you guys were using that wing, we simply drove by and looked in all the other doors. We didn't even enter the building most nights, much less sweep the hallways." He leaned forward, his face worried. "Have you seen any more indications of potential intruders?" Mom's blood froze. She persisted, "We saw you for sure. We observed a torch moving from room to room and inspecting everything all night long." Lauren supported her. "We didn't hear any alarms going off, glass breaking, or anything similar. Who else would spend every night roaming around a dumb, deserted building?" The atmosphere changed. With a sigh of relief, the senior guard eased up and reclined in his seat. After taking a gulp from his glass, he muttered, "Oh, that only applies to the doctor." Uncomfortably, the younger guard tensed up and rapped on his almost empty beer bottle. "Which physician?" Lauren pressed, her chest becoming irritated. The older guard leaned his arm against the bar top and leaned back in his chair, groaning. In the past, while that hospital was operational, it mostly provided care for the mine and, on occasion, the nearby town. Still, it was too small and far away to lure a whole staff away from one of the larger hospitals in Morris County, even if it was the only hospital that the majority of those individuals would ever see. They had employees that worked every day, sometimes non-stop. There were just a few nurses, a few housekeepers, and at least one doctor. As the older guard went on, the younger guard began ripping pieces of paper off the label of his bottle. Commercials. As far as we know, he wasn't the first physician to work up here, but given everything he accomplished for the community, he might as well have been. Even though the hospital was directly next door, he still found it to be too far away on most evenings. There in the sick bay, they had a cot prepared for him. He took care of the miners as if they were his own children. Sweeting from his bottle, he did so. The idea that women should return home at night was still widely held at the time. After their demanding jobs, which of course they still shouldn't have had, they should rest their tired female legs. He gave Lauren and Mom a sharp, accusing look, and they rolled their eyes and giggled. Therefore, he would typically eject the nurses at night and perform rounds by himself. He only had an old torch with him, and he used it to sneak through the hallways in his slippers while looking through patient charts and taking vital signs. With a sigh, he raised the bottle to his mouth once more. He passed away peacefully in his sleep, right there in his cot. Some claim that one of the patients was awakened by the fact that his hand was not on their wrist. Others believe it was one of the nurses who greeted her with his thorough report in the morning after realizing what had happened. To honor the loss of a provider in the course of duty, the group sat in silence for a while. However, he never clocked out, the guard added. The youthful security officer averted his gaze. For years, there have been instances of break-ins without an alarm going off. A bystander calls the police after spotting the torch bouncing through the hospital's hallways and assuming it's an inquisitive youngster. The officers chastise the caller for wasting their time after finding nothing. The property owners finally hired us to keep the kids out after we made enough separate calls. However, it was never children. The doctor was always the only one involved. The medics were startled when the younger guard eventually said, "He tries to help." Following an alarm trip, you'll be strolling around the hospital when you hear a voice murmuring behind you, in the basement. You'll descend to discover a jerk who shattered a window and cut his hand badly. He looked nervously at the two women. You'll be patrolling, and he'll thump you with the chest, stopping you just like a ceiling tile crashes down in front of you. He'll say "scoundrel" when you shine your torch in the new medic's chambers, whatever that means. After hearing this account, the paramedics were utterly silent. John, Mom's co-worker, finally remarked, "I mean, at least he's trying to help." Paramedics have a strong superstitious streak. Long before Mom told me this story, I knew that. However, I was unaware of how superstitious people could be. Mom watched me, closely examining my face as she concluded her story. At first, I thought she was hazing me or something, so I chuckled. I assumed that this was just a new member custom that I had not yet heard of because I had recently begun volunteering on an ambulance squad that my family had been on for generations. "Did you get to visit the doctor again?" With eyes sparkling with the excitement of a fresh tale, I inquired. "No," Mom said with a deathly solemn shake of her head. "In the end, that building was deserted. However, I wanted to let you know about him so that your first overnight shift wouldn't come as a surprise." I folded my arms. After all, I have experience working overnight shifts. She gave me a familiar look, the one that oozed implicit contempt, and said, "Yeah, right. A true overnight shift at an actual squad building, complete with ghosts of its own." I tried to figure out what she was saying while massaging my neck. How about Mom? Maybe this entire event served as an allegory to remind me to honor the first responders' accumulated experience before me, particularly those who were part of our family, such as my late grandmother. "No, my mom isn't haunting the squad house," Mom said with a dismissive wave of her hand. "However, there is someone. Additionally, he will be watching you, so you should behave yourself well." I laughed and said, "Okay, Mom, I'll be fine." As the evening turned to night, I failed to remember Mom and the doctor. With only a few calls in the beginning of my shift, things went rather smoothly, and I was lucky enough to get a few hours of sleep. As the moon rose across the gleaming wooden floor of the room where I slept, I wasn't thinking about ghosts. However, I did hear something that startled me up in the early morning hours because I am such a light sleeper. There was a squeak, similar to the sound of work boots on wooden floors. I heard a voice as I slipped into awareness. In my ear, a rough male voice said, "Hey," it grumbled and said, "Come on, get up." I was about to apologize to a senior squad member for whatever call I had obviously slept through when my eyes snapped open and I sprung up in bed. However, I was by myself. The only other indication of life in the empty building was my partner snoring in the room next to mine. I heard the tones squeaking out from a mobile radio set in my partner's room way too softly. Just as I was ready to lie back down, we needed to answer a call. As we hurried to the emergency, I woke up my partner, put on my boots, and attempted to process what I had just gone through. I've now had a couple years to consider it, and the answer, I believe, has always been obvious. There is superstition among paramedics, and I am now too.